Welcome to the Startup Field Guide, where we learn from successful founders of unicorn startups how their companies truly found product market fit. I'm your host, Sandhya Hegde, and today we'll be diving into the story of Weights and Biases. Started in early 2018, this is a developer-focused ML ops platform, last valued over $1 billion. Now, if you're trying to put an ML model into production as a part of your core product experience in a company, you need to be able to manage it effectively, right? You need to be able to experiment with it, track different versions of it, collaborate over it across all these different people in the company who want to make sure that the model is doing what it's intended to do. And this is actually a really hard problem given the complex nature of machine learning of models for both data scientists and developers. So over 500,000 people today from 700 companies use weights and biases to manage their ML models. And our guest today is their CEO, Lucas Viewald. Lucas, welcome to the Field Guide.
Thanks for that nice introduction. That was a great overview of weights and biases.
I'm glad. And, I think the reason I'm so excited to have you on the Field Guide and talking about this is that, you've been in this space for over 20 years now, which, makes you one of the veterans. So you started working in Stanford's AI lab back in 2003. You started your first company, which also helped people get ML models into production in 2007. And so I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about your journey so far, like what inspired you to start Crowdflower and then Weights and Biases, and and how you look at the big picture of AI evolving in the past couple of decades.
Sure. Well, it's funny. When I was a little kid, I was thinking about AI, and I was thinking, kind of what maybe we all think, are just like, wow, like what a cool thing that computers can learn to do stuff and you don't have to program them. And I sort of thought in my head, like I was imagining, okay, this is probably like the last job that people will do. I'm actually not sure if that's true anymore, but that just seemed so interesting and exciting. And then I went to Stanford, and I was studying AI at a really different time when it wasn't so exciting, like things weren't really working. And when I was in the AI lab, it's funny because so many people there went on to be really famous and successful. But it definitely didn't feel like that at the time. It just felt really frustrating. Like, nothing was working. I mean, I was trying to do these essentially like toy problems, and I couldn't even get the toy problems to work very well.
Right.
And so, I actually left to start a company really out of frustration that it felt like all the problems we were working on were just problems where there happened to be data available. And so what Crowdflower did was it collected training data for people trying to build machine learning models. And it was really early. I mean, I really started it with this idea that, this would just be useful. I mean, back then, Y Combinator had just started, but there wasn't the same sense of like, lots of people should start companies. And, I remember in my first decks being advised to remove any mention of AI, from the pitch deck, which is so funny compared to now.
Right, because there were these like waves of skepticism, right?
Yeah.
Where people were like, oh, yeah, this is finally going to work. And Lucas is perfect. He has a background in math. He has a background in CS. He'll figure it all out. But then, lots of companies struggling, like you said, to even like make the toy demo be an effective demo.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, at the time I had no idea like the difference between like, sales and marketing or how, that might work. It took me over a year to raise the initial, money for Crowdflower. We raised $100K, and I was like, what are we going to do with all this? We raised $100K at a $2 million valuation. So that was like a really long journey. And I learned a lot, changed a lot, got married, had a kid. And I was thinking, when Crowdflower sold, what's the company that I really want to do? And actually I had one of the things that happened to me was I'd kind of gotten interested again in machine learning. And I was sort of feeling like I spent so much time running companies that I'm kind of becoming a dinosaur. Like some of my core assumptions were being challenged. Like, for a long time, we just thought training data was the most important thing. And like,
Right.
The different kinds of models don't really matter. Like, and people were constantly claiming I have a better model that works way better. And they kept being wrong. And so there's a lot of skepticism about neural networks and deep learning. But then, I remember when AlphaGo beat the best Go players, a real wake up call to me where I was just like, this is real and this is totally different. And it's so exciting. And so I actually worked with a new co-founder and my old co-founder, and we really wanted to make like a product for the machine learning practitioners building models. At the time we were looking around and there was really good products like, Domino Data Lab and
Right.
Data Robot, but they were so top down. They weren't really things that we wanted to use ourselves. And it's so funny because all these things were like actually contrarian in 2018 when we started it. Like I remember we had to convince investors that new tools were needed for machine learning. We had to convince investors that machine learning was an interesting, market to actually work in. And we had to convince investors, can you believe it? We had to convince investors that like a bottom-up strategy or product-led growth was actually like a good idea.
Right.
I mean, all those things went quickly from contrarian to like incredibly mainstream, but
Right.
I guess that's how those things go.
Yeah, I have a few follow-up questions. So I think the 2018, while in some ways the future was already here, right? Like the first LLM, the transformer methodology, like that's kind of already here, only no one has paid true attention. So I'm curious, like, what was that aha moment like for you? How did you dig in when you first, read about the Transformers architecture? Attention is all you need. Like, how did you respond to kind of diving back into that world? And then, in terms of industry adoption, like there was very little adoption of deep learning at the time. People were, using ML in production, but very few companies were. So I'm curious, like in your mind, how you thought about that dichotomy of like, okay, there's like this really advanced technique that a very small handful of people are working on and understand, and then most people don't know how to leverage it or deploy it. I'm curious who kind of your early design partners were for your vision of weights and biases, and like what were they trying to do with ML models?
I think our starting place was not like, like super strategic or something that like, McKinsey consultant would like come up with. I think that our real logic was like, we love this technology and we love what it looks like it can do. And it's so exciting. Like we just want to, be part of this. And so I had actually done kind of an unofficial internship at OpenAI where I just said, hey guys, like, can I'll work for free and I'll do whatever you want. And I worked with like, I think it was like a 24-year-old grad student, just kind of being his like minion, coding up random stuff for him. It was actually really a helpful experience to just sort of get back in the flow of like making stuff, but also kind of quickly get up to speed on, what was going on in deep learning. Like, I'm the kind of person I can only really learn by doing. And so that was like a really core design partner in a way. Like they used our stuff really early. And then we also we did a lot of work with Toyota in the early days. I mean, we obviously like begged everyone to like take a look at what we were doing, and no one was interested. And Toyota was kind of like, actually, what we said to Toyota was like, look, we'll do whatever you want. And we were even asking them like, hey, we'll just like come sit in your office and literally do whatever you want. And they actually wouldn't let us like badge in and do random work for them, but they were willing to meet with us weekly. And I think we kind of proved to them that we'd really listen to them and kind of iterate, with them. And so it was actually the combination Toyota and OpenAI were two really early design partners. I mean, we wanted more, but just people weren't willing to like play with our nascent libraries. And again, it took a long time. And I mean, it was probably a year of like just mostly working with them, not as like a strategy, but just as like literally we couldn't get anyone else interested in, in what we were doing.
And, one thing that I've observed is often when you're building dev tool, you want to go bottom up, it's all the startups that adopt you first and try you out. Like for prototyping, maybe they don't have a lot of customers, they are they're less risk averse, they'll try the new tool really quickly. However, if I think about 2018, training data was still a blocker for people to actually deploy models. So small startups can't really, do it. Most small startups can't do anything. It is the
Yeah.
big companies.
Yep.
Which were the big companies that you saw actually using ML in production well? Like who was your, list of like, this is what best in class looks like outside of OpenAI and Toyota? Like were there other companies that you would call kind of, on the bleeding edge?
Yeah, I mean, so my last company, Crowdflower, we also like sold into ML companies. So I did kind of know the space. And I think who was doing it well? I mean, well is an interesting question. I guess for me, like doing it well means you have a thing deployed that's doing something useful for someone. And, it's sort of like industry by industry. Like I think like at that time, autonomous vehicles was like a really big emphasis for like every car company.
Right.
And then there were like a lot of startups doing it. And I mean, I remember Cruise seemed like they were really doing a good job, and like Waymo seemed really exciting. Back then, there was a lot of emphasis from like e-commerce and search. And so you'd see like, Amazon and eBay and kind of the big commerce companies really cared about this and had good methods. But I think, this was like kind of like before the explosion of applications, and it was pretty vertical specific. Like that's one of the problems we had at Crowdflower. When we started the company, we kind of got like Google and eBay as customers, and then there wasn't that much more of the market to go to. Like it took a long time before their folks caught up. And I think at the end of the day, machine learning is pretty enterprise heavy, right? Like enterprises tend to have the most data.
Right.
But I think a lot of startups they're more scared to sell to enterprises than they should be. And I think, VCs often are nervous about advising companies to sell to enterprises. Like I think if you're going to be in machine learning, you have to sell to enterprises. Like there's not really like much of a startup market for ML.
Yeah, outside of prototyping, which you'll find, hundreds of. But I think that's a fabulous point. I'm curious, so what were some of the early use cases that you could see were just resonating a lot more with people, as opposed to just kind of the whole platform approach that, you eventually have every successful customer adopt? What was like the first thing people like just desperately wanted to do with Weights and Biases?
Yeah, and I think like, our approach has always been to, I think in contrast to a lot of our competitors, they want to build the full platform first.
Right.
And we've been much more narrow in scope. Like I don't think we even now have a complete, set of like offerings. Like we try to kind of nail the specific pain points. And the first pain point that really resonated, which still resonates today, is logging what's happening during training. So we call that experiment tracking. And it's so funny because investors thought that was like really niche. Like they hated that, like that use case. And I actually think like there's kind of a lesson there. Like I kind of look for products that, like every investor has like these workflow diagrams, and they're like really well researched. They're like reasonable. They're like reasonably accurate. But I kind of look for products that don't live in those diagrams, yet customers want them. Because like, of course, like Amazon and Microsoft, they'll build the stuff that's like in those workflow diagrams, but it's kind of the stuff that doesn't show up there where they're like real pain points that I think everybody misses. And so, yeah, like experiment tracking, like now it's so funny, like people kind of inject it like into the workflows. But at the time, what we knew was like, I mean, it's actually as simple as this. People were like logging to a thing called TensorBoard at the time. And then they were having trouble sharing it because TensorBoard was hosted locally. And so like people would, get some result and then they would like actually like literally like screenshot the
Right.
tensor board and like email it to their colleagues. And then when the colleagues wanted to like pull it up, they like couldn't because it like ran locally. That was actually the pain point we saw. Really, really specific, feels niche. But I don't know. Like I think we just really wanted to solve. I mean, we're kind of desperate to like just get people to use our tools by any means necessary. So it's sort of like, okay, we know like one person will use this, right? And so, we got our friend at Toyota to use it and he was happy, and then we got our friend at OpenAI to use it and they were happy. It wasn't like a really like big top down scheme. It was just like we were desperate to get people to use anything.
And so walk me through kind of maybe the first 12 months of Weights and Biases. Like at what point did you have enough people using that, first feature or two that you felt comfortable saying, okay, let's open this up. Let's see who else is interested. What was your approach to kind of doing a GA launch if it was, in your first year?
Okay, well, we might need to go to like the first 2 years to actually get to someone actually using our product. But what we would do, so me and my co-founders, we would go and we would like rent like a cheap Airbnb in the woods or something. And we would just spend like a week just like nonstop, like working together. And then we would like take it and we'd show it to our, whoever, like literally would beg people to like look at it and try our library and stuff. And, it's funny, Sean, one of my co-founders, called it demo-driven development because we were really just trying to make like demos that were like convincing enough that someone would even like take a longer meeting with us.
Right.
And it was really hard. Like, we would kept showing people. I remember we spent a whole week like building this thing that actually turned out to be the experiment tracking product. And we built it for Toyota because this guy, Adrian, hopefully he's listening to this. I remember Adrian was like, I need this product. And then we built it. Like we built a whole product in a week. I mean, it's 3 good engineers just cranking together. And then like Friday afternoon, we like drove up from like Santa Cruz where we were staying to their office and like showed it to them. And he's like, I don't know, like I'm not that interested in this. Of course, we were like pretending like, we like had that product like the whole time.
Right.
Right. And we showed it to him. He's like, I don't know, like it's not that cool. Like, I want to do this other thing called hyperparameter optimization. And it was like so deflating, but like you pretend like, oh yeah, like, oh, we also have hyperparameter optimization. We'll like show that to you like next week.
On the roadmap, like coming up.
Yeah, exactly. And then it kind of like the traction was really slow. Like I remember having conversations with, my co-founders, like, does anyone actually like want this? And I don't know, like it just, I mean, we had a few people using it. I mean, it's not even like they loved it. And then we did this thing. I'm telling you like the true story. Maybe you should like edit this for brevity.
Perfect.
But the other thing we were doing is like, we also like, I was doing classes in machine learning at the time. And so I was just like desperate for people to use my stuff. So I was like, maybe we could modify this to like work for our classes that we're doing. And there we would get like 40 people to use it all at once because they were just in the class.
Right.
And that was like interesting because you would really feel the onboarding, so like it would try to get 40 people to use it. It would break for like 10 of them. 10 other people would be confused. It's actually really stressful because I'd be like standing there like, oh no, like, and then my co-founder, Chris, would be like, just like sitting with people's laptops quickly trying to get them to use it. So that actually got our onboarding, I think, better than, like way better than it would have been otherwise. And then we got a little bit of traction. It was like pretty flat. I'm talking about like 20 weekly active users, and it was like this moment. This guy, Hamel, I hope he won't mind me naming them. I say this all with like love. Hamel Hussein, he was working at GitHub at the time and we were really trying to get him to use it. And I remember it was Thanksgiving. He called me and he's basically like, Lucas, I got to tell you, like, I think your product is good, but it is like so ugly. Like, so like, like the UX is so unbelievably bad that I'm going to like use your competitor that has like, like worse scalability and like worse like features just because their UX isn't so like awful.
Oh no.
And so I felt so bad. And then I started like a panic with my 2 co-founders. Like we just have to like, we had what we called like a a bug bash where we like went in a room for a week, and instead of like building new functionality, which is what we'd always done before, we just kind of cleaned up the UI everywhere. And it was funny that actually really, I think that was the moment where the product started growing, and it was like slow growth, but it was the thing that really felt promising to me was it was so steady. Like, like we had 20 people one week, and then we had like 23 people the next week, and like 26 people the next week. And I remember like showing my, our small angel investors at the time. I was like, I think this is like kind of got legs, like it's kind of taking off. And they're like, man, Lucas, these numbers are like so small. I remember they're like, call me when you have like 1,000
Right.
weekly active users. This is ridiculous. You have like 25 users and you're like proud of it. But it was like the same ones coming back, and each week it was like a little more.
Yeah.
And I think I'd just been doing startups for so long that I'd never really seen that before. Like each week we have more users than the week before. And that just felt like so good. Like we just felt so much like promise, because it really just felt like we were like building in this way that we'd never experienced. And then, so we got really excited about like finding other ways to get, more users in the product and using the product. And that actually, ever since then, it's felt like we had some kind of product market fit. So I do actually think it was actually this Hummel, complaint that really, I think that's the moment where it started to take off. But I don't know. I was actually going back and looking at this because I think this would be really useful to know. Like as we launch like more products, like what was the thing that made experiment tracking take off? Because it's definitely flat for like 18 months, I think, and then started to grow. And it's hard to put your finger on exactly what was it wasn't like there was major functionality change. I really think it was that UX cleanup inspired by one person saying they're going to go with a competitor product.
I mean, it speaks to like the value of having design partners who give you like brutal feedback and just say what they are thinking and feeling, right?
Yeah.
It's incredibly valuable. So this is 2020 now. You have, you started with like a nice cohort of 20 weekly active users who are happy. They're coming back. They're telling other people about your product. What was the persona like from the early days? So you just always focused on developers, or, especially given it's still 2020, was it, a mix of actually like data scientists, statisticians, developers, like, both people who are coding versus people who are just kind of focused on the math behind the model at the time?
Well, I think one thing that's really worked for us really well has been, we started the company with a user profile in mind. And that was basically, we call it ML practitioner. And we picked a word for that person that's not a title, because I actually think the titles are kind of confusing. Like what makes somebody in our ICP is that they are like, their job is building and deploying ML models. And I feel like I've been fighting this fight with investors like from the very first day, where like
I apologize on behalf of my entire profession.
No, I get it. I actually totally get it. And maybe it's stupid, but it's just like so clarifying to have like a single ICP. I really think that's one of the things that's really at the core of why our product is so loved, because, it's like, I think if you have like two profiles, and you could argue that we should, right? I mean, there's MLOps persona, there's like a executive persona. These personas do matter. But I think when you try to please a lot of people, obviously you don't end up really pleasing like anybody. And I just am like, look, the product is made for this particular persona. I can tell you all about her. Like, and that's just been like our true north since the company started. I've just been sort of obsessed with keeping the focus on that. And like tons of objections, right? Like people are like, okay, this is too narrow, it's too specific. The market's bigger, you can make more money like selling into like executives. Maybe all true, but at least I think we have a cohesive strategy and a cohesive product.
So a follow-up question there, which is, when you talk about kind of really building only for this ML practitioner, like the person is going to deploy it, manage it, what are examples of like adjacent needs or use cases that so far you have said no to, which, someday as the company grows, you might think about. But like, what are the obvious adjacencies you've had requests about that so far you have said no to like maintain your focus?
Oh, there's so many. Because like the space is so exciting and change and growing so fast, right? There's like a lot of demand for different things. So the obvious place where we could expand into, and I reserve the right to do this. But
I will
we're talking
permit
now.
it. I will
Yeah, yeah.
permit it. No worries.
Thank you. So there's this ML ops persona that's really important inside companies, and they're actually not ML practitioners typically, right? They're usually actually people with more of a DevOps background that is trying to make a reliable internal platform, to deploy the models. And I have a lot of empathy for them, right? That's a hard job, right? It's sort of like they're doing what we do, but internally trying to get ML practitioners to like, do, follow like a cohesive process and make their stuff reliable. And so like one thing that they really want is like infrastructure. And we've really decided not to do infrastructure, even though I think it's like a huge pain point, right? Like, like the place where you run your models and like making that reliable is like, of course, like a huge problem. But it just felt like a big distraction, and we want to integrate with other people's, infrastructure. Like we don't want to compete with all the infrastructure providers. And so that's been one of these things where it's like, wow, there's so much money to be made in that, but we want to maintain our focus. And the ML practitioner, I think, cares less about this than the ML ops, persona. So if you were serving them, you definitely orient towards infrastructure. And then there's like the executives that care about all kinds of different stuff than the ML practitioner. They often, I feel like, they just want like a checklist of features. So the practitioner wants tools that solve their problems that they face daily, right? And they actually want flexibility to know that, hey, if there's like a different tool that's better, I can like go and use that. For some reason, executives really seem to want like to buy one product that will solve like all their problems. And I actually think it's like a terrible idea, but it is like very pervasive, in the market. And so I'm at the point where it's like, look, if you pull out like a feature checklist, we just lose, and we love that we lose. Like we lose to like every competitor. We have like less features than all our competitors. And, like we just do. And it's like, if you're just looking for like checking every box in like an MLOps platform, we're going to lose. I mean, we do have good integrations with other tools that will like check the boxes where we're missing, but we're just not gonna make like crappy software.
I think that, is very strategically aligned to also pursuing a bottom-up motion, right?
Totally.
Where, like, yes, the exec cares about like, oh, I need to buy software that solves these 17 problems. If you could do all 17, it makes my work easier. So could you? But your end user's like, no, I only work on 2 of those 17, and I want the best solution for those 2.
Yeah.
So if you're focusing on like customer love in terms of, who's actually using you, it makes more sense to be narrow, not build the others until, you have the right scale. I'm curious. So going back to 2020 when you first started taking off, your UX is now better thanks to Hommel, and the word is spreading. So I kind of have 2 questions. One, like what were the tactics you were using to grow awareness about weights and biases? Like what worked, what didn't work in terms of just like growing that early user base? And 2, like what were surprises for you in terms of, what people were saying about it, how people were using the product? Do you remember any nuggets from, the early days where you're like, oh, I did not see that coming?
I think both of these ideas were kind of due to our now head of growth. So we have this woman, Lavanya, who was an engineer, but she really had like a knack for like growth. And so she really ended up like driving a lot of our growth. Of course, it was a team effort, but I feel like she had these like just clever ideas actually that were like surprising. So one thing that we did was we made this feature called reports. And actually it's funny, there's this engineer, John, who built reports, and he was like, he told me, he was like, this is so stupid, Lucas. Like people don't want to share their stuff inside of the application. Like they want to put it in like Notion or some nice place to,
Right.
they'll like paste it. And I was like, I think they do want to share it inside of Weights and Biases, but I actually had some self-doubt. And I remember really doubting, I was like, hey, John is like running a project that he thinks is stupid. Like this seems like it's destined for failure. And then he made like such a beautiful reports feature. Like he really wanted to use it. Like he did actually just a killer job with it. I couldn't believe it. Because usually that's like bad management, right? Like people should believe in their task. And then what Lavanya did was she got our users to publish reports publicly. And then she worked with this other guy, Axel, to actually SEO it really well, which I was also really skeptical of. Like, I was like, I don't know, does SEO really work? Like, for us, it really worked. So, like, people were publishing lots of content, very long tail content. I mean, I'm talking like super technical, maybe there's like 100 or 1,000 people interested in it, but those people are very interested. And so they're like searching for it. And we're the only place where, it exists. So just like, one gradient descent method versus another, or like,
right.
And so that became our best way of getting users on our platform, because the cool thing is like people are using our platform to like publish their work. And then people are actually like seeing how the product works through SEO first. And so a lot of people, they like kind of know us as this place where they like learn about, machine learning for a long time before they ever even go in and use it. So that's actually our main way that we find users. And I really like it because it's very, very organic, and it also just has steadily grown. So at first it was small, really small. For a long time, it was like, oh, we got like 5 new users like last week from this strategy. But Lavanya really believed in it. And I think she knew that, or she kind of saw that you could grow it over time versus like, if you get press like once, you might get a huge influx of users, but it's just that one time.
Yeah, it doesn't sustain.
It doesn't sustain. This is much more steady.
Makes sense. And there was no like confidential data in the things they were publicly publishing. So your users felt comfortable doing that.
Well, it's funny, right? Because like reports is used for confidential data internally.
Right.
And then also like, there's in our market, machine learning, there's a lot of academics, and a lot of academics use our product. So we've made it free for them. And they like to publish things especially. But, we love it, actually. I mean, every so often we can convince a customer to publish something publicly because, they want to share, they want to recruit or something like that. And those tend to work really well also.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the things that really helped Amplitude spread within the companies once we were adopted was a very similar feature where you could share like a public URL link for some specific dashboard or chart with everyone in the company, and people could like click and interact with it, even if they weren't, signed up to use Amplitude at all, or, didn't have access to Amplitude, because in big enterprises, like no one really has like true data democracy in terms of who has access to what data for, good and bad reasons. And you couldn't really do that with any existing analytics tool. Like either you had access to the whole tool or it was screenshots. Like you couldn't really have anything interactive. So yeah, if there are any founders working in data listening to this, here's one guaranteed tip. You better try as well. No, that's a really awesome story. And were you getting any, surprises in the customer feedback once people started using, Weights and Biases, discovering it in the wild? Like, what were some good and bad surprises for you?
Well, I'll say like one really positive surprise has been like how passionate people are about their experiment dashboards. Like I still don't feel like I quite understand like the level of enthusiasm that people have. And I've been doing this a long time. So it's like, my last company, we collected training data. It was very useful.
Right.
But, with Weights and Biases, like people will sometimes just post videos of how much they love the product, or they'll write in and say, like often it's like, hey, I found this bug and it's a bad bug. but they'll be so nice about it. Like they'll be like, but I love your product and like, don't worry about it. Like, it's like awesome. And I mean, I don't, I know this is like a podcast for founders. I don't want to make anyone feel bad, but that really has been like an interesting surprise is how passionate people have gotten about the product. I think like the other surprises maybe has been like the requests that people have been really interesting, and they've led us in interesting directions. Like I think we have this new product called Launch, which was really pulled from tons of user feedback of like wanting to basically launch jobs from the Weights and Biases interface. And that's a funny one because like I think I'm a little bit older than our audience, and I'm just like really comfortable inside a terminal. Like I just shell it to a machine and like run stuff. And I think that like our audience is more seems like very interested in like web UIs to do more. That's been a real learning. I mean, in general, like notebooks are really pervasive among our audience that we don't know. I think me and my co-founders often joke like I'm the one in our founding team that kind of understands like infrastructure the least. And I think they sometimes talk about they like sort of build for me because like I'm like kind of hazy on like how like Docker works and like Git works. And so I think a lot of our product is like abstracting away some of these concepts for like machine learning people who are like me, just like, I don't know, like I can Google stuff, but I'm like I'm a little bit confused about
so you have to like pressure test it by seeing if Lucas can make it work.
Yeah, and like seeing what Lucas like thinks about it, I'm also, it's funny, there's another joke that like I can't like read, like I'm like illiterate. And so what they do is they make the quick starts really short, but I actually think it's really important. Like I don't know why everyone makes their quick starts too long. And it's funny, like when I'm like looking at a new product to consider using it, I feel like when the quick start is like too many steps, I like really don't want to use it.
Yeah, no, this is the big challenge for all like product-led companies that aspire to have great self-serve experiences is like how long is your customer's attention span?
Yeah.
Right? Like, and how do you like keep their attention every 5 seconds, right? Like I think that is a really hard thing to get right, no matter how easy or complex the underlying product is. And maybe those like student classes you did were a really, really formative experience to like help you push that bar really high.
Well, those are amazing because what that really showed me is if people get confused at any step, then they'll just go away. Like it was just really interesting. Like people always get confused, and like we thought it was so obvious what to do, but like I mean, that's like worse than a bug. It's show stopping. If like someone can't figure out how to like just paste the authentication token into their code, you'll never see them to complain about it. So I felt lucky that we had those classes to torture students with in the early days.
Maybe the question I really want to ask you is, if you were starting Weights and Biases now versus, you started in 2018, like in hindsight, like would you do anything differently? Like is there a different set of use cases or a different way that you would build a Weights and Biases, like the product itself, not the long-term vision, which I think is, super well aligned to the future that we are all probably going to live in?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that I would do now, and that I'm like trying to do now, is I think that the software developers now really can do a lot of ML, and that's different than a few years ago. So I think that's like the big change. And like, I guess for me, I view it as sort of expansion of our user persona, but they have like different needs and coming from like a little bit of a different place. I mean, I think like, when you're a startup, you can adapt so much faster than, a big company to what's going on. And so I would be like all in, I think, on like, LLMs and like, how do we support this? And of course, like, you don't see a lot of production use cases yet, but, I think it's obvious that this stuff like works super well. It's unclear like what tools need to be made to, make those work. But we're also trying to do that. So please don't compete with me.
Right, we won't. So maybe switching gears a little bit to, how you've built your team. I think you grew a lot during the pandemic. Like that was like a bulk of, I think you went from like about 20 people to the team you are now. What's been your approach to, leadership? Or what are kind of lessons from the Crowdflower days that you brought to the new company with you? And how are you trying to create a strong, connected culture?
Well, I think like one thing that I really, really am obsessed with is goals and like orienting around goals. And that's even like I think something I'm obsessed with when we're like four people, but it's like just more and more important as we grow. Like you sort of have like alignment naturally with four people. But even then, it's like there's questions like, should we be oriented towards optimizing revenue or optimizing like active users or
Right.
optimizing retention? And I think it's like that clarity on like what, we're trying to do, I think is something I'm really like obsessed with because I've just like watched people, get confused and get like misaligned and like thrashed. I think especially when we're like a remote team, we try to have like real clarity. And then I think also like, I think just as I get older, I'm more obsessed with like writing things down because it just feels like a much more scalable way to communicate than talking face to face. So, we create like a lot of docs, which I actually just think is a better way to run a business. I think like when you talk, it can be like a little bit like sloppy and people forget. Like I think it's just like, kind of written documentation. And probably some people that work from there like listening to this like laughing, like we should do like more of that. But I do like way, way, way more of that than I used to. And like actually as we've gotten bigger, like Crowdflower kind of got to about 100 people and like stalled out. Like I think we were like 130 or 40 when we sold, but it's a much slower run. And so I kind of thought like a lot of like best practices that executives, coming from like a Facebook or something would bring were just like unbelievably stupid. Like I just sort of thought like when people go to big companies, like something happens to their brain where they just like get all these like dumb, like, orientation. But now I kind of realize like why it happens. Like when you're scaling fast, you really do have this different set of challenges. But I think it's important not to like, when you're small, obviously copy what like a really high growth company is
Right.
doing. It's like so bad, right? Because it's like you just do exactly the wrong thing in a lot of cases. So
I'm curious, like, what would be your advice for, early stage founders and developers that are, trying to like build their first product, build prototypes that are AI native today? Like, what would be your advice for like how to think about, focusing on like the end customer, the product, the use cases versus figuring out like all of this like infrastructure and what are the right choices to make around infrastructure and tools and what would be your advice? Like, are you writing the, definitive guide to building ML products sponsored by Weights and Biases? And then, what would the intro say?
well, I don't know if this is ML specific, but I just feel like everyone gets this wrong. So it's worth saying, which like I would just like make something for like one person or two people or three people and go from there. Like everybody's worried that they're gonna like end up doing consulting or something, but like I just don't think that really happens that much. Like I just like when we launch a new product, for example, we don't, for the beginning try to grow it as fast as possible. We try to build it for like specific people that we know and we
Right.
talk about and try to make them really happy. And I think it's even okay to like prioritize like the weird things that they want, like out of like respect for their time. Like where you're like just sort of quickly iterating on like, okay, you like want that weird thing, fine, we'll do it. Just because it's actually even now we have like a huge amount of reach. Like I think we have a good brand. We have all these customers. When we want something new, nobody wants to use it. They still don't want to use it. And it's like you just have to like I think like one thing that people don't realize, and I think even YC doesn't tell you well enough, is how much people are like not interested in like what you're doing and like how much you have to like beg people to use your software. I mean, I still like, I mean, I have all these like tricks, essentially like SDR tricks of like, setting tons of reminders to like email people like over. I expect to email people like a million times before they'll meet with me. And then, yeah. And then when we get feedback, it's like golden. I think like once you actually show somebody that you really will like implement
Yeah.
the stuff they're asking for, I think then you have like a friend for life too. Like, so that's like my big advice is like make a really small number of people really happy. It's harder to do than you think.
That's really great advice. And I actually have a hot take from a previous podcast episode where the co-founder of Amplitude, Curtis, and I were talking about exactly this, which is like, what is the approach you take to idea validation, message testing, prototyping for different types of products? And what the two of us kind of like landed on was, if the promise of the product, right, the idea you're trying to validate is something that, plenty of people have promised for a long time, your customers are not paying attention anymore. They're like, yeah, I have been pitched that snake oil again and again. So until you have something that is like truly like working, like, I don't have to like imagine it, like it's real, don't bother me, right? Like it's just not. As opposed to if you're doing something where the problem is new and no one's really made promises about it before, it's way easier to like do idea validation just with like message testing that, okay, this is something people are looking for, they'll pay attention. As opposed to for, problems that are more evergreen, even if the problem is big and deep, people are paying less attention because they're kind of, jaded. Right? Like they've already like seen it, heard it too often, so they're tuning it out now. So that was
I think I have to say, I don't know if I agree with that. I think people always tune you out. Like I've never had the experience. I feel like I'm usually making a new product in like a new space. And I just feel like no one pays attention to me in any scenario. Like you might just be thinking, look at a different market. But I think it's just the universal experience. And I'll say my co-founder, Chris, is like a genius at this. I think the more you can make your like demo look like it's real, like in all the little details, like people show me demos. It's like, don't put demo in the URL. You know what I mean? Like don't like, and our engineers, they like want to like, with the demos, they want to put all these like warnings on it. And it's like, you can't do that, right? Like you gotta like, you gotta like show somebody something and like really be like, this is the thing. It's like, you can't just be like hedging like, oh, this is like a weird demo. Like you gotta like really show them something real to get any feedback. Because if somebody thinks they're looking at a demo or worse, like a PowerPoint, they just don't actually really engage with it.
Yeah, like show me the thing working.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Well, this is awesome. So listeners, if you loved this, there is more of it. Weights and Biases has an awesome podcast hosted by Lucas called Gradient Descent. It's one of my favorite ML podcasts. Please go check it out. And Lucas, thank you so much for joining us today. I enjoyed this immensely.
Thank you. That was a lot of fun.
You've been listening to the Startup Field Guide with Sandhya, an Unusual Ventures podcast. Stay connected with us by subscribing to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you liked what you heard, please rate our show and help us reach more aspiring founders with lessons on how to find product market fit. Thanks for listening. Until next time.